We're looking at a series where we ask questions. And as you know, many people, when they are wondering about something, they will Google it, or you don't even have to do that. You just ask Siri, and she will give you the answer. I assume Siri is a she, because she has a very lovely voice when she talks to me. And I have asked her many questions over the years that I've had access to a smartphone. But one of the questions that she is not able to answer is, how do I deal with suffering? This is one of the most challenging questions we are ever going to face. And I want to begin by admitting up front that I don't have all the answers. But someday when we stand before God, He will give us a full understanding of what is going on. We know that trouble and suffering of various types will affect the lives of people all over the world. It touches all of our lives as we are even gathered here today. And some of you might be going through some really hard places, even in this moment of time. As we've thought back just over the past year, we know that people have lost their homes and their lives because of fire, because of hurricanes, floodwaters that rose so high that it destroyed everything they have owned. We know that people live in abject poverty. We still hear of wars and rumors of wars that are all around us. Some of you have experienced illness. Others maybe loss of employment. And some of us have lost family and friends through death. I became aware of others who've been held in captivity, as even we prayed as a church for the last 2.5 years, that one of our pastors from Toronto in the Light Korean Presbyterian Church was held as a prisoner in North Korea for 2 years and 7 months. And about a month ago, he was released. So one of the questions we ask is, so how do we deal with all of this? How do we begin to cope when we see all the suffering that actually exists in our world? There is a word in the Old Testament called hesed, and the word means loving kindness or loving faithfulness. And you will see over and over again that the psalmist asked this question, God, how can this happen? Aren't you supposed to be one who has hesed, loving kindness toward us? Haven't we been walking in your ways, and yet these realities are taking place? Probably the most profound answer to some of these questions is found in the book of Job. It's a very intense book. There's a lot there, and I don't even begin to try to unpack the story that is there. But he is going to give us a profound example of a man who went through suffering, and it wasn't immediately resolved, but there are some amazing discoveries that he made along the way. And I love the book of Job because he doesn't try to sanitize anything. He speaks very realistically and truthfully about issues of pain and suffering and disappointment. And as I read his story and as I reread his story, I begin to ask, how much could one person take? How much? I don't even begin to come near any of the elements of suffering that Job went through. But I can tell you this, that as we look at the suffering of one man, we are going to see that it touched every single area of his life. The first thing we see is the evil of other people. Now, Job was a very wealthy man, as you read or heard being read in the scripture this morning. He was considered one of the wealthiest men of his day. And then there were a group of people, the Sabaeans, who came down and they stole all of his oxen and his donkeys. But that was not enough. They even put to death his servants who were looking after them, the herdsmen. And one escaped to tell the story. And then almost immediately we read there was another group of people, the Chaldeans, and they came down to steal all of his camels because Job had a caravan trade, and that's how he made some of his money. He was like a businessman dealing with other peoples, and they stole all of his transportation. But more than that, they also killed all of his employees who were working for him, with the exception of one man who escaped. But it wasn't just the evil of others. We read in the opening part that there were natural disasters that Job encountered. Lightning fell from the sky and it caused a fire. And we're all familiar with that. We know that many forest fires have been set ablaze because of lightning strike. And this caused a great bushfire. And it was so intense that it killed all of his sheep. They couldn't escape. And as we've looked at some of the reports of the wildfires that are going, we see that many animals have not been able to escape. And then his children were having a party, and they were in one house, and a tornado came through, and it caused the house to collapse. And all of his children, not one or two, he lost all of his children in that disaster. Now we can begin to understand a little bit about tornadoes and lightning and hurricane, and that a lot of this can be explained by natural laws. But in Job's case, the enemy, Satan, exploits these acts of nature to his own end. He takes an advantage of this to try to give an interesting twist. And what he's hoping is that through these natural disasters, Job will give up his understanding and his relationship with God and curse God. And often they will ask this question, why me? Why is this happening? Why does God allow that? And many people will ask that question even today. But I think Satan has even a more powerful weapon than just raising these questions about why am I losing all these things. He begins to make known the evil intentions of the human heart. Why did they kill all the servants? Why did my children have to die? And so many of us will ask these questions today as we look at life all around us. Why do people steal? Why do people rob other people? Why do they do terrible things that will maim people for life? Why will they take another person's life? I've not experienced a lot of these things. Our house was robbed once. I've had my car broken into several times. In fact, it got to the point I decided never to lock it at night because I knew that people they were looking for loose change in the console. So it was far less to lose a couple of dollars than to have to replace a window or a broken lock in the door. And I could kind of brush it off and say, well, that's kind of life. But people robbing and killing and maiming, this is so much more serious. And we look at the death camps that existed in Europe. We look at the mass graves that exist in Bosnia and Rwanda. We think about the bombings that happened in New York and Paris and Kenya and Mogadishu from yesterday. And the list goes on and on. But it's all a reminder that an unredeemed heart is capable of evil beyond imagination. An unredeemed heart is capable of evil beyond our imagination. And so Satan's best tool in his toolbox is to allow people to follow their evil desires. And when that happens, he wins. And when people follow their evil desires, lots of people suffer as a consequence. So Job experienced that reality. He knew what it was like to experience the evil of others. He knew what it was like to experience natural disasters. He lost his fortune and he lost his family. But Job has an interesting response. And the response he makes is this: naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Now notice this. In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Sometimes when we hear that statement that Job made, we think he seems to have been able to brush it off quite easily. And somehow he's even lumped his material loss with the loss of his children. But to do that is actually to misread the book of Job. Later on, as we go through this book, we begin to see the great pain and agony and struggle that Job experienced, especially when he lost his children. Losing his children was everything in comparison to the fortune that he had amassed and was gone. Because later in the book of Job, when he recounts the times that God had blessed him, his family is the focus of the blessing. It is never on the material assets that he has. And sometimes in our culture, when we see that people have done very well, we might say, "You are really blessed." Job would say, "No, I've been really blessed by the children God has given to me." That is the essence of life, because when you think about it, the only thing that's going to last forever is your relationship with God and your relationship with others. All the other stuff we gather together will one day be gone. And some of us know that it can go just like that in a heartbeat. But there was more. Job continues to experience more suffering. And the next act of suffering is actually physical disease. When you read through the book and you read Job's story, you think, I'm reading a medical text, because he had open sores. He suffered from insomnia. His skin was blistered to the extent that it had all turned black, which would indicate it had died. There were ulcers on his body. His teeth were rotting. He suffered from high fever and diarrhea. He was physically just exhausted. Now imagine Job being emaciated that way by the ravages of disease. And in fact, in one part of the Bible, he is so ill, he just pleads with God, "Let me die. Let me die." And this physical disease and suffering is exacerbated through elements of dementia. He becomes fearful. He starts to hallucinate sometimes. He has delusions. And all of this compounds the suffering that he is experiencing. But there's more. And the more focuses on the broken relationships. See, some of our suffering is because of loss of health, loss of income, natural disasters. But there's also suffering that happens through broken relationships. Now, Job was a person who had many people in his life. And after the death of his children, his wife said to him, "So Job, why don't you just curse God and die? Forget about it." You know what the other thing she said to him in the whole book? "You know, you kind of have bad breath." It's not too encouraging in this journey. But Job had 3 really close friends. Their names are rather strange to us. They were called Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they came from 3 different cities because they had heard that their friend Job was not well. And when they get to see Job, he is so emaciated and he is so sick, they hardly recognize him. Maybe you've had that opportunity to visit a friend who is very, very ill, and you realize how gaunt they have become and how their physical appearance has radically changed. Well, Job was so ill that these 3 friends hardly recognized him, but they knew that death was near. And so they decide to do something which is wonderful. They just sit with him. And we are told they sat with him for 7 days. And during that time, they said nothing. They just sat. There is something wonderful about people who will just be with you and not give you all the answers because you don't ask for those answers. But 7 days is a long time. And they decide it's time for us to go home because nothing is happening here. They think that Job's as good as dead. But now they have a change in their thinking. They begin to ask this question: I wonder if Job has done something wrong, and that is the reason why he is suffering. Let me tell you something. There's a lot of that thinking that goes on today, even in our culture. That exists. I must have done something wrong, therefore this is happening to me. And they saw the suffering that he was going through was actually the judgment of God. You know, they are not far off in their thinking if you think about the disciples of Jesus. One day in John chapter 9, Jesus was talking, and a man who was born blind was brought to Jesus. And this is the question that was asked. They said, Rabbi, or teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You know, I've had that question asked in my own family. My youngest brother was born with Down syndrome. And I overheard people saying, your parents were such good people. I wonder what they did wrong that God brought this judgment on them. And you know, when my mother heard that, I think she lived with a sense of false guilt for the rest of her days, wondering, did I do something wrong that caused Stephen to have Down syndrome? That's a hard thing to deal with. And there are many people who still struggle with that reality today. You see, the disciples assumed there were only two possible explanations. The first one is, this man must have sinned, so this is the judgment of God. Or his parents must have sinned, and the judgment of God is now falling on this man. And so we know that because of sin, suffering and death has entered our world. Before our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned, there was no suffering in the world. And in a sense, we need to understand that all the pain and suffering that has entered into our world comes because of this evil one who still has power and authority, which will one day be totally gone when the Lord returns and he creates the new heaven and the new earth. But in the meantime, we live in a broken, fallen world. And there are times that there will be a link between a person's sin and actual suffering. So, for example, if I am driving my car and someone cuts me off and I get so angry that I now decide to cut this person off, and maybe I hit their car and cause it to roll into the ditch and it turns over, and they suffer multiple injuries and become a quadriplegic for the rest of their life. The sin of my anger being acted out has caused now irreparable suffering in another person's life. We know that sexuality is a gift given to us by God. And God says, here's the parameters where I want it to be fully expressed. And that is within a loving, committed marriage between a man and a woman. But if you've read the newspapers for the last few days and weeks, look at all the sexual assault and harassment charges that have been laid against individuals, and look at the pain and suffering the victims have experienced. And some of them, it's been for decades because they have kept it locked up inside. And let me tell you this, those headline stories are just the tip of the iceberg. Because a lot of folks who don't make the front page of the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail or the New York Times are people who have suffered those same types of experiences. At times we suffer from the hands of other people, and we have a right to plead for vindication from God. The error is to assume that there is always a direct correlation between sin and suffering. So what did Jesus say in response to this question? The response was, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Through his blindness, God would receive glory and honor, and the glory of God would be made evident to all people. And what God is saying is that even in the midst of suffering and all the hardships of life, God can triumph over the greatest evil that even people can bring about. And God will ultimately bring his plans to pass. You see, Job's friends, these three guys, refused to see how God might use suffering for his glory. Well, Job at times had his trust kind of shaky. When all these things happened to him, he mourned, he cried, he protested, he questioned God. In fact, he even cursed the very day that he was born. In fact, saying, I wish I'd never been born to have to go through all of this. But he held out one single hope. One single hope. And that was he was going to trust God. He wanted to know why he had to endure so much and why things were so difficult for him. And when we go through hard times, we often ask God, so why is this happening to me? Why do I have to go through this? And ultimately, the only answer God gave was the fuller revelation of himself. God was saying, Job, I know you have all these questions, but Job, you need to understand this. I am your answer. God was saying to Job, I'm not asking you to trust in a plan, but I'm asking you, Job, to trust in a person. Job, I'm asking you to trust me. Learn who I am. And when you know me, and you are understanding who I am in relationship to you, you're going to be able to handle anything. See, if God had never revealed himself to Job and asked him to trust him, it would be simply blind faith. It would be a leap into the dark. But God was saying to Job, get to know me, and as you know me, then you can trust me. God never requires us to take a leap into the dark on blind faith. He asks us to take a leap of faith, but our faith is based in him whom we know. And so, when we look at Job, we begin to see what he was like. Have you considered my servant Job? Look at him. There's no one like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God. He's a man who shuns evil. He still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. This is the man who is going through this period of testing. And what does Job say? He says, I will trust. I will trust. And the statement of trust is made in these words. Even though God takes my life, I will still choose to trust God. I will still choose to trust God. You see, Job knew enough about the character of God to know this, that God is trustworthy. To me, that's the bottom line. Do you and do I know enough about God to know that he is trustworthy no matter what I'm going to experience? You see, Jesus knew about suffering as well. He was born into a hated race. People hated the Jews. They still hate them today in many parts of the world. The legitimacy of his birth was doubted, and that was thrown into his face. He found work so challenging that sometimes his family thought he was crazy, and they wanted to bring him home and shut him up. He was betrayed by his closest friends. He faced all kinds of false charges that the religious establishment laid against him. He was convicted unfairly. He was tortured. He was put to death. And what did he do? He trusted. And his cry at the end of his life was, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That is the ultimate statement, I believe, of trust. The Apostle Paul, who had initially been a persecutor of Jesus, became his greatest follower. And he suffered much. And he has this amazing statement that helps us to understand a bit about suffering. And he says, we know that suffering produces perseverance. And perseverance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom he has given to us. There is the reality of suffering, and we are not going to escape it. We are all going to experience it in some shape or form, and maybe in a multitude of forms. But God says suffering can even produce endurance. And for many, the temptation is, let's just quit when life becomes difficult. But God has said to us, and he wants us to understand, that difficulties can become a way of deepening our relationship with God. The Korean Christian church has suffered great persecution over the years and is still suffering it today, especially under the communist regimes. But one Christian pastor who had been punished and imprisoned many times, beaten and tortured, wrote this statement that has stuck with me for a long time. And he said this: as Christians, we are like nails. The harder you hit us, the deeper you drive us. Their dependency upon God is absolutely essential for all of life. God says this can be the shaping of your person. Blind hope, like blind faith, will disappoint you because you'll simply wander aimlessly around. But those who place their hope and their trust in God will never be embarrassed, will never be disappointed, because the hope is given to us by God himself. As we come to the end of his life, Job was able to make this amazing statement. We sing it over and over again at Christmas when you follow Handel's Messiah. Many people don't even realize that's where it's coming from. But Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, in other words, even after I die, yet in my flesh, in that resurrection glorified body that God is going to give to us, I myself will see him, God, with my own eyes. I and not another. And then he says this: how my heart yearns within me. How I desire that more than anything else, that one day I shall stand before God and I will see God face to face. Today, maybe you are struggling with disappointments. Maybe you're struggling with sickness or hurt or injustice or sadness, suffering of loss in various ways. I don't understand it all. I don't understand it all. But more than that, I don't have an answer to it all. But I urge you, wherever you are in this season of life, to be like Job, to simply put your trust in God and to know that you belong to God. The words of Paul in the 14th chapter of Romans, in the 8th verse, are words I think about as I deal with all of this in life. The words simply say this: if we live unto the Lord. And if we die unto the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. Today, I invite you to trust God regardless. Let's pray together.